5 years ago, 6 years ago,
Okay. Yeah, I have some papers here.
Oh.
They're very hard to read. I'm just letting you know.
Hard to read?
Very hard to read. Because the copier got, schwach. So this goes together. It needs more time. Yeah. That goes together. There's two papers. That one's sided. Okay.
You all have fun reading?
Give a Ephraim one that you could read.
Oh. Hopefully we can read this.
Okay, Reish Lamed Beis, Sif Yud Aleph. We did Sif Zayin last week. Ches, Tes, and Yud. I'm not doing inside. Sif Ches, Tes, and Yud. I think this is good. Sif Ches, Tes, and Yud. I'm not doing inside, but if you want to look at them, you can. Sif Ches, Tes, and Yud talk about different types of disclosure in MEKACH, where basically the synopsis of the Sif is a case where you had 5 mistakes, you had 5 mumin, and you told the person about 3 of them and 2 of them, etc. So I'm not going to get into that. But the case I want to talk about is a suffix MEKACH, when there's a doubt in the MEKACH. Now, a doubt in the MEKACH could be in 2 ways. One is, I don't know that there's a problem. I just suspect that there could be one. So is that enough grounds to create a MEKACH? And the other case, which is maybe more common, is that there definitely is a mum in the MEKACH. There definitely is a problem. But the question is, when did that problem happen? Maybe the problem took place after the sale. It happened after the sale was complete. So it happened by the buyer, not by the seller. So it would not be grounds for MEKACH. Clear? Those are the 2 questions. So, question number 1 is a sif in Shulchan Aruch. We'll see there's a little stira. It's Geshmak Inyan. It's Sif Yud Aleph. Reish Lamed Beis Sif Yud Aleph goes like this. Very tiny print I gave you over there, but try to figure it out. Hamoicher behema lechaveroi. I can't really read it. It came out. The toner ran out in the middle. Hamoicher behema lechaveroi litavcha. So I sold you a animal for the purpose of shchita. V'nimtza treifa, and if it was found to be a treifa. Now, the first thing is im noida bevadai shahaisa treifa kashalakcha. If you know for sure and you could figure out that the treifus was there when you bought it. Because remember, what happens is, the person bought a herd of cattle, and he kept it for a month. He shechts one of the animals, and it turns out to be a treifa. He goes back to the seller, hey, this animal's treif. Has a problem with the 4th stomach, has a hole in it. So the guy says, yeah, I sold it to you when it was fine, and it got that hole in your possession after the sale. So that's not grounds for a MEKACH. So the first thing is you have to prove that it happened in the possession of the seller, not of the buyer. How would you prove that? Kigoin, for example, shenikav beis hakoisais, there is a hole in the stomach, v'huglad piyamaka, and it's a scab. It's a scabbed thing. So it doesn't scab for the first 3 days after it gets that hole. So if you bought it 2 days ago, and now you shecht it, and it has this scab, this hole in the stomach with a scab on it, so you know that hole happened 3 days ago. That means it happened in the possession of the seller, not of the buyer. Have a MEKACH tos, and therefore it's a MEKACH tos. And therefore the seller has to give you back the money. Now, by the way, there is another whole chiddush over here, which we'll talk about next week, which is a very geshmak sugya, which is that, why doesn't the seller have a taina? Hold on 1 second. I sold you a cow. I'm more than happy, if you want, to be mevatel the sale. But if you want to be mevatel the sale, give me back the cow and I'll give you back the money. Now what are you giving me? Useless meat that I can't even do anything with. So you went ahead and were mazik my animal. You can't just go.
No other way to find out.
Okay, so here the only way to find out the mum is if I shech the animal. But what happens if there's a way to find out the mum without shechting the animal and you were mazik it? What's going to be the din? So there's a lot of interesting, a lot of fascinating cases like that. Okay.
You're allowed to sell an animal as is. Look, I don't know what's going on in its lung. I haven't checked it.
I don't either know.
Right.
What does that mean? As
So I'm
is.
selling it on the condition that if there's a problem with the lung, it's not. I'm selling it as is. You're taking the risk.
If you speak that out.
Like I would take the risk if I checked it.
Okay, if you speak that out, but I'm not buying. I'm making a wedding for my. I'm buying this for a wedding. I'm not buying this because I'm a slaughterhouse. I run a slaughterhouse. I'm buying this because I need meat for yontif. So, if it's not going to provide me meat for yontif, I don't want it.
Is there a diuk to be made that it says how much of a himalach available tough?
Yeah. It's a diuk. We have two pshatim in the diuk. We're going to get to that in a second. So, v'lohugla piyamakav. Does have a suffix im nikev tuch shlosh yavim. What happens if? I don't know. It's hard to tell when it happened, and it's a suffix. So now it's a suffix if the guy sold you a defective item. You have this defect. You don't know when this defect took place. Im lav al lokeach lahavi raya. The buyer wants to get his money back. To get his money back, he needs to bring a raya that it was the moicher's fault, it was the seller's fault. V'im loy, and if he cannot bring a proof to that, yafsid, he'll lose. Now, before the next 5 words, you would think, why does he lose? Because hamotzi mechaver of a raya. You would think that the concept in Shas in general, we paskin, is hamoitzi mechaveroi olav araya. Whenever you have a suffix in mammon, you don't know what to do. You keep the money as it where it is. Possession is, what's the expression? Possession is 90% of the law.
9/10.
9/10. Okay. So you have the money. You becheskas. You have the cheskas mammon. So since the seller has the money, the buyer is trying to get the money out of the seller. So the buyer has to bring a proof that the seller sold him a defective item, and then he can get back. Otherwise, he can't get back the money. But if you would learn that that's pshat, what happens if he didn't pay yet? He bought it on credit, and he's going to pay 30 days later. He shechts it, and he finds that the animal's a treifa. Now he's the muhzak. Okay, yeah. So this is going to say. So you would say, okay, now the motzi mechaver is the other way around. Now the seller has to prove that it wasn't treifa when he sold it to get the money out of the buyer. Whoever has the money, that's where the din should be, right? Yet, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, the end of the sip, he would have to prove. No, he would have to prove that the treifas happened by the other guy. V'yitein hadamim, but says the Shulchan Aruch, if you cannot prove, if the buyer cannot prove that the treifas happened in the possession of the seller, he has to pay. Even if he didn't pay yet, and he shechts it and it's treifa, and he cannot prove when that treifas happened, he has to pay. So it's obviously not al t'motzi mechaver al avaraya. It's obviously there's a reason why we're benefiting the seller in this case, because even if the buyer didn't pay, if he can't prove that the mum was by the seller, he's at fault, considered, and he has to pay. It's a very big chiddush. Not only it's a big chiddush, it's a direct stira to a halacha later in Siman Tes Zayin, which is on the second half of your non-existent page.
Is this an established slaughterhouse these buying this from?
No, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. But this is something there's no way, there's no fault here really, right? Because no one could figure it out, this treifas. But let's look at the second case. The next case is that Reuven sold Shimon cheese, and after 3 days when he opened the cheese, he sees that it's all spoiled. Reuven shemachal l'Shimon gvinos, ula'achar shlosh yamim paschim, u'mitzam merukavos rekavan gadol. So he has to go find out from a cheesemaker expert and ask him how long does it take for such a cheese to reach this level of mold. Right? If this type of mold could happen in a day, so then maybe it happened in the buyer's possession. If this type of mold had to have been growing for a while, so then it clearly happened in the seller's possession.
With the cheese, you see what you get. With the
No, it was in a closed. It was in a closed. This is not talking about Ziploc and Miller's Munster. This is talking about you're buying a barrel of stuff from the farm, right?
Look at it on purpose. An animal, you can't really inspect it.
Okay, that's why it says you didn't open it for 3 days. Now you're saying that goof is your fault. Okay, why didn't you open it? Because it smelled. I don't know. It was Yom Tif. You're fleshik for a week straight. So you didn't bother opening it. Now you open it and it's spoiled. Im yoimru shenaseri kavam beveis hamoicher nimtza shaya mekach tois. If the cheesemaker can determine how long the mold has been there, so that will determine the case. If it happened in the possession of the seller, it's mekach tos. If it happened in the possession of the buyer, it's his bad luck. But if it's a suffix, the cheesemaker can't figure it out. It could go either way. What principle do we use when it's a suffix? Says the Shulchan Aruch, we go back to our good old principle of hamoitzi mechaveroi alav araya. Who's ever the one trying to get the money has to prove it, which the Sma in Sif Lamed Hey speaks out. That means that if the seller bought it, if the buyer paid already, he's trying to get the money back, he has to prove that the mum happened by the seller. And if the buyer did not pay yet, then the seller would have to prove that the mum happened by the buyer to mechayev the buyer to pay, which is logical. Whoever has the money, possession is 9/10 of the law. So if the buyer paid, then he's trying to get back the money. He has to prove it. If the buyer did not pay yet, and he finds it, then the seller has to prove his position because he's trying to get the money out of the buyer. That's clear. So Sifteh Zayin says very clearly that you go with the Moitzi Mechavel Varaya. So why, in the case of Sif Yud Aleph, which seems to be very similar, we don't know when the treifus took place, all of a sudden there, we don't go with Moitzi Mechavel Varaya, and we say that even if the buyer didn't pay, he has to pay, again, because we can't figure out where it was. Clear question, right? And clear after. It's a stira. What happens if the buyer didn't pay yet, and you find the mum, and you don't know, do you have to pay or not? So what the Pomper said over here is the Teretz brought down in the Ketzois and the Sma. Basically, that there's a distinction in the two cases, and the distinction in the two cases is like this. When in the case of the treifa, suffix treifa, in the case of a suffix treifa, we have another principle. And the principle is that every animal, at least if it's more than a year old, let's assume it's more than a year old, every animal has a chazaka that it was born as a kosher animal. And it only became a treifa later on in life. How do we know that? We know that because an animal can't live more than a year with a treifus. Chazal say, once an animal has a treifa, it dies within the year. So since the animal dies within the year, if the animal's 2 years old, you know it was not born with this problem. So you know that the problem developed later in life. Since you know that the problem developed later in life, there's something called a chazaka d'mi'ikara. Chazaka d'mi'ikara means that once you know a fact, you don't assume any change until you can prove otherwise. So memela, it's called cheskas haguf, and you keep things the way we know they were until you can establish that they changed. So for example, you measured a mikvah, and the mikvah had a kosher amount of water, 40 sa. Okay? Then, a few months later, you check it. Now, it turns out, it's missing water. It's missing water. It doesn't have the shear. So you can assume it was full until the last possible moment. All the people that use the mikvah till then are tar. Only the last possible moment, then it loses the water. Something called the chazaka. That's what we rely on for the Erev. The chazaka, if it was kosher 1 week, it was still kosher. Right? So, the cheese doesn't have a chazaka. Because cheese is spoiled, we know it spoils eventually. So, we don't know exactly when. But the animal has a chazaka, that it's not going to become treif. And since the animal has a chazaka that it's not going to become treif, if a treifa happened to the animal, we assume it happened at the last possible moment, and therefore the buyer since we found the treifus in the possession of the buyer, we're going to assume it happened by the buyer's possession. Okay? So anytime you have a chazaka, a cheskes haguf, this would happen. Now, I don't think we have it that often. But, but this is the principle over here. So, what we would say is, let's go back to this rule, that if you... Right, if the animal would be only a year old, so you don't have a chazaka yet, and the suffix would happen, then the halacha would be that it's a suffix, and whoever has the money wins. Who's ever holding the money would win. Okay? So, this is in a case when you have a... We're gonna go soon into a case. It's a little harder to... And I'm gonna need your help on the case that we're gonna bring up. But for now, this is the halacha. If you have a treifa, if you have a problem, you have a mum, and you don't know, does it make a mekach taos or not? Was it in the possession of the buyer, possession of the seller? It's a suffix. So you go by the chazaka. If it was paid for already, so the buyer would have to prove his position. If it was not paid for already, the seller would have to prove his position, unless you have a specific chazaka proving the seller's position, saying the problem must have happened by the buyer. Okay? Which could be, let's say you would clearly have like a dent in something that clearly happened after the fact. When it was manufactured, it was definitely manufactured with no dent. And the dent definitely happened later. So one could argue you have a chazaka, right? If the question is how it was manufactured, that's a different story, But, okay. Now, let's go to another point that in this itself, let's go to the next sif, and then I want to go to your other diak, okay? Let's go to the next sif on this point itself. What happens if it's a different type of suffix? It's a suffix. We know that there's a treifa, and we know that it happened by the seller. But there's a shaila in halacha if that is considered a treifus or not. It's a machlokes. It's a shaila. It's a suffix if this is called a treif. What's the case? Sirchus, problems with the lungs. All the what are they called in English? What? Oh?
Cilia?
Yeah, those things. What? Some growth in the lung that would indicate that maybe there was a hole. It's a suffix. Basically, every sircha makes a reisa, and it's a suffix. Whether it's a suffix, we know where it was, but it's a suffix in halacha. If we treat that as a treifus. So now what happens? Do we split up the two halakim of Shulchan Aruch? Yeridea, the buyer is stuck. In Yeridea, the halacha, you have to be machmer. So he takes out his Yeridea, it says to be machmer, so he can't eat it. He goes back to the seller, and he says, hey, mister, there's a mum. The seller doesn't pull out the Yeridea, he pulls out a Choshen Mishpat. And Choshen Mishpat, it's a suffix. It's a suffix. I don't have to. You have to prove to me that this is called a treifus, and you already paid me, so I'm not giving you back your money. You have to prove your position. Well, I can't prove it because I'm not going to weigh in on the machlokes Rashba and Ramban, right? So what do you mean prove it? I can't prove it. It's documented as a suffix. Well, if you can't prove it, I have the money. I don't have to give it back to you. So now the guy's stuck, right? So here's the Ramah. The Ramah in Sif Yud Beis. Treifus de sircha, hu adin de mevatel MEKACH, v'yesh cholkim. And by the way, the meaning nowadays, I think Mr. Malin was here, and he was saying this far, and it's true, is that nowadays, sirchas are not going to be valid MEKACH toys, because the minig is that you accept it. You have to take the risk. Maybe that kufa goes into the price. Kufa goes into the price, that there's a possibility that there'll be a sircha. But nowadays the minig is that you accept sirchas as your risk. But that's why there's a suffix here. But however, if you want the tzad that you have to that the buyer has to accept the sircha is because since it's such a common type of treifa, if you want to protect yourself from sirchas, then you have to speak it out. That's what you were saying, Shul, right? that you have to speak it out. So that's what he's saying. In a common treifa, a treifa which is common, if you want to protect yourself from that treifus, you would have to speak it out and say, I don't want to take responsibility for that. Now, if you have a hole in the stomach, that's not so common. What?
The buyer.
The seller. No. The buyer. The norm, since it's so shchiach, the understanding is it's understood that you're taking the risk. If you don't want to take that risk, you have to speak it out. Now, vafilu treifa shanu oyster misafik, even a treifa that we aser misafik, mevatel hamekach, ve'ena moicher yochel loimer aisirai the treifa habla. Unbelievable Ramah, Kishmaka Ramah. The Ramah says that if there's a suffix treifa that we're machmer on, the buyer can be mevatel the sale and go back to the seller and say, I want my money back. And the seller will say, oh, prove to me, you got to be a big London, prove to me that the Rash was right. I hold like the Ramban, it's not a treifa. So I don't know. Right. So he says, oh, if you don't mind, so then I'll get back to you to eat, right? Oh, we haven't had this in a while, that it rains in the middle of the share. Okay. So the Ramah says that, I'm not going to talk louder than this, so if you can't hear me. Yeah. What? I have a microphone. If the what? You're good. So the seller has to give back the money. Why? Because at the end of the day, the buyer can't use it. The buyer can't use the item. So clearly the sale is being done. Clearly the sale is being done for the purpose of the buyer to eat it, and therefore it's understood that I'm not accepting any treifas that are going to stop me from eating it. So even if it's only a suffix treifa, but since it's a suffix treifa on the Issa Deraisa, the buyer can't eat it, so he's allowed to go back to the seller and get back his money. Okay? Now, based on that, we can go back to your diak. Okay? I think I'm going to get the microphone. I have like a little speaker. It's fine? Okay, fine. So, in Sifyat Aleph, there's two seats right here. In Sifyat Aleph, Rabbi Pomper had another diak in the Lashon. It says, "Hamoicher behema lechaveroi litovcha." The introduction to this whole sif was that I'm selling it to you to eat it. I'm selling it to you to eat it. V'shachta, and in the end you shechted it, and you found this treifus. So the question is, the Nesivus asks a question. Let's say what's another reason why a person would potentially buy a cow? A cow. Maybe he's buying it to plow. Maybe he's buying it to work. But the Nesivus says that even if a person buys an animal to work, he may still not want it to be a treifa. Because remember what we said before? Treifas live only a year. So why is the treifas only a problem? Why is the treifas only a problem if you bought it for shchita? L'chayra treifas should be a mekach tois even if you bought it not for shchita. So memela, why does it say here l'tafla? That was your question? So treifa ein achaya. So why does it have to be davka l'tavcha? That's the Nesivus' shayla. The Nesivus of Katan Gimel. Kishma kashayla. Why does it have to be davka you bought a l'shchita? So the Nesivus says, based on the Ramah and Yud Beis, because the Mechaber wants to include even a suffix treifa. A treifa that we're machmer on in your adeya. So a treifa that you're machmer on in your adeya, so now, since I bought it for you to eat it, you can't eat it, it makes a mekach tois. But let's say we have a whole other set of halachas. Let's say we have a case. You bought it to plow, and you find now that there's a suffix treifas. I don't know if it's a treifa. Over here, you can't say, "Well, I want to be machmer." No. You have to prove your position. The buyer would have to prove their position that this is actually a treifa. Because don't tell me if you bought it for eating and there's a suffix treifa, so the suffix treifa is ma'akiv you, doesn't allow you to eat it. So that bevadai. But if I sold you an animal to use as for plowing. Granted, if there's a treifus, it would make a mekach tois, but a suffix treifus would not make it a mekach tois, because the buyer would have to prove his position.
If it dies within the year, would that be a raya or
What?
mazlav? If it dies within the year,
I don't know if you could prove that if it died within years.
then
Treifus.
mazlav kara.
Right. And also, you're not going to weigh in on the machlokes, Ramban Rashba, because the animal died. You'll say something that's happened. So if it's a suffix treifa and you bought it for non-eating, here you wouldn't say, since I have to be machmer, the buyer wins. You would say amatzi mechavel v'ray, and you would go back to that rule, and therefore it wouldn't be included. And that's maybe according to the Nesivos why we included that. Okay. What was that? No, we're saying maybe you bought it for more than that, but that's the whole. But
Unless he knows coming into it that, is that line we stop the trip? The problem with that animal first.
he doesn't know going in. He found out later. But the fact is, he can't prove it's a treifa. Since he can't prove it's a treifa, the seller doesn't have to give him back the money. Because back to that rule that when you can't prove your position of treifus, you can't prove the mekach tois, the seller wins. Now, what happens if there's something? In general, what you see from this Nesivos is that, in general, what's the halacha of a suffix mekach tois? Something could be a problem. I find out that something could be a problem. So first of all, if the thing which could be a problem and it makes a vade problem, then
How do you know it's shepherds?
he found out later.
How do you find that?
It died. I don't know. He said it died, and now he opens it up.
Now the guy wants to get back his money after it died?
Yeah.
He thinks it died because it was a treasure.
Not because it does, but he opens it up and he sees that there's a suffix treifus.
But it died.
Okay, so
You bought it to plow, it died. Guy can't plow it. Oh, you know what?
now it's mekach tois. Yeah, now it's a mekach tois.
The kind is, I bought it because I want it to last, and you showed me something that died because of its treifus. So it could be a
Died
sold
because
me
it
a
died.
Right, so it's a suffix. It's a suffix. So one of the seifim we skipped was, what if you buy an eved, and the eved turns out that he's a ganev? It's a Jewish eved because whatever. So it turns out that he's a ganev, and what?
That's how the Jewish ever got into houses, no?
Yes. Well, right. So it's an eved. It turns out he's a ganev, and or he's muchtav l'malchus. He has a sentence on him. He's been running away from the government. So it makes a mekach tois, because I don't want a slave. A, because the government will take him. B, I don't want this guy around my house. What happens if it's a suffix? He was convicted, but it's only suffix if it actually happened, right? It doesn't make a difference because bottom line he was convicted, right? So it won't make a difference if you have a suffix, but if you have a real suffix mekach tois, what you see from this Nesivos is that the suffix mekach tois will not be grounds to mevatel the sale. It's only going to be grounds by achila because that turns into a vade now.
Does it make a difference if you paid already or not?
We got into that before. You can listen to the first half of the share. So it does. It could be it does. It could be it doesn't. Depends. B'derech kal it does. B'derech kal we would say it does. Only by when you have a chazaka, chazkas aguf maybe. Okay. Now there's another very very big nafkamina of why the Shulchan Aruch mentioned that you bought it for shchita. Okay, which is kind of the segue into the next few seifim. Okay, your Gimel, your Dalet, Tezvav all go together. Okay, and the other reason why the Shulchan Aruch said shchita is a very simple reason. Is because, like this. I mentioned in passing, the buyer's going back to the seller, and he says, I want to undo the sale. I want refund. I want a refund. So what does the seller say? No problem. What does most sellers say? No problem. Bring me back the item, and I'll give you back your money. Well, I don't have the item. I shechted it. Sorry, man. You shechted the animal. It's dead. You're giving me useless meat. I could have used this I should use this cow in my plowing section of my farm. Now you're giving me back shechted animal. Doesn't help me. So you essentially were mazik my item. So why should I give you back? Why should I give you back the money? Remember, the way we learn is that when you're mevatel the sale, it works lemafreya. It works that retroactively, it was never a sale. So retroactively, it was my cow, and you shechted my cow. You went into my farm, basically. You came and shechted my cow, and now you're saying, "Oh, sorry, I want my money back." Can't do that. So why doesn't the seller have a taina to say, "I don't want to give you back the money because you're not giving me back the cow"? You give me back the cow, no problem. Isn't every MEKACH that way? Every MEKACH is, I don't like the item, take back the item, give me back the money. But I don't have the item anymore. So the answer, right? Good question. The answer is because you bought it for shechita. If you bought it for shechita, so the understanding is that you're going to go ahead and do what was supposed to be done. Now, the taina is, before you're going to do something which is going to ruin the animal, check it. Teretz is what you said. There's no way to find out this problem until you shecht it. I didn't do anything wrong, essentially. So since I didn't do anything wrong, even if you want to say that retroactively, I'm a shomer chinam on your item, retroactively I'm like, retroactively it's the seller's animal, and I'm a shomer on it. I have to watch it. Okay, but I was never pesheya. I wasn't negligent. What I did was exactly proper. We made up. I was going to buy it, I'm going to check it, and I'm going to check for the treifus. So therefore, the seller can't come to claim to the buyer and say, "Well, what's going on over here? How are you giving me back the animal?" No. I wasn't pesheya. I did nothing wrong. But it's mashma. If you learn the Shulchan Aruch that way, then it's meduyek. Now, what happens if what you mentioned? What happens if I bought it? I didn't tell you I was buying it for shechita. I was buying it maybe to plow. And then I decide one day, my son comes home and says, I finished my first Masechta Mishnayos, let's make a Geshmak Asiyim. So you go ahead and shecht it, now you find the streifa. Hold on. Who told you to, you don't have a right to go shechting my animal, you never told me you were buying it for shechita. Now you're a mazik.
If it passed a year, it's not a problem.
Well, if it passed a year, right, correct. Then you don't have a claim against the seller regardless. So
any time that it's more than a certain amount of time that the treifa could have happened later.
Right, it's going to end up being a suffix.
It's going to be a suffix, and it's going to be.
And the seller's going to, the buyer's going to lose.
Right. The question is that
it's got to be immediate, because otherwise you always assume that it happened in the buyer's possession. So memela could be another pshat, and why it says latavcha. The reason the Shulchan Aruch had to say that he bought it for shechita is because he has to give the rights to the buyer to shecht it. Now that he had the right to shecht it, he didn't do anything wrong, and when he found the treifus, now he's allowed to do it. Okay, now, and that's going to be the segue into the next sif. The segue into the next sif is going to be talking about like 2-3 cases where the only way that you were able to find the problem with the merchandise that you purchased is by ruining it first. Well, one of the cases is you bought a roll of fabric, looks fine, but the only way to find out if it's going to hold up is you have to cut it and wash it and this, and then you see it's not holding up. So again, there's going to be this shaklavataria, whether now does the seller say, "Look, I don't want to do MEKACH, you're not giving me back the stuff that I sold you." Or do you say, "No, you could do it anyway"? So we'll learn next week. That's a segue into that. Okay? So,
Well, if
fine.
also selling, he knows he's going to use it to make clothing.
Exactly. So maybe...
He's giving him, he knows he's selling him something with permission that he's going to...
In a chanami. That's why there'll be a connection between these seifim. Okay. That's good. Shkoyach Rabbi Sai.